Hello dear friends. In this session we will be working with environment variables. We'll learn how to create them, how to change their values, and of course how to output them to the log so we can see their values. In GitHub Actions there are two types of variables. These are default variables and personal variables that we create. We've already encountered default variables in previous lessons. For example, if we open the fifth workflow, we see that we output a certain variable GitHub repo to the console. We use this variable to input a value in the branch. We use this variable to output the commit ID, and actually in GitHub Actions, the list of these variables is quite long. You can also find them in the documentation. As you can see, the list is quite impressive. Next to the variable, there's a description that can also be used. Pay attention to the syntax. Default variables, first of all, have the prefix GitHub, and secondly, they use uppercase letters. In fact, when writing variables, there is no such requirement. We can use, firstly, any prefix. Secondly, any case sensitive, either uppercase or lowercase or camel case or underscores. Write your variables however you find it convenient. So let's create a new workflow for the current lesson. We have the 11th lesson, and I have a question. How do you write 11th? 11th workflow. I sincerely hope that is indeed how you write 11th, the number after 10. And as a reminder, let's use what we had previously in the 5th lesson as a demonstration. We will trigger this on a push event. So, why aren't you highlighting EML? I set the extension incorrectly. So I was worried about the name but made a mistake in the EML extension. So for now I'll output the environment variable github.ref. Also besides this variable, guys, I'm going to access the GitHub context through an expression and get its key ref. Remember, in the previous lesson, we output the entire object through JSON, and we also had ref there. So I'll rename the step for you and rename the title of our workflow. Now let's create our personal variables. You can create personal variables at several levels. First of all, we can create it at the workflow level, and it will be available throughout the entire file. You can create it at the jobs level, and it will be available in a specific job. And you can create it at the step level, and it will also be available only in that specific step. Let's demonstrate this visually. To create a variable, we use the keyword envy. Next, we write the name of our variable. As a synthesis, I already mentioned, you can write both uppercase and lowercase, but I recommend you write in capital letters. Because, well, look, if we create a variable status, it's not clear. Confusion immediately arises. But if we create the status variable like this, it is clearly highlighted. If we also add some prefix to it, well, in this case, let's just use workflow as a prefix. Let's abbreviate workflow like this, and not status, but just custom to. So, I'm going to use this kind of name for the first variable and just set its value to 1. This way, I'm creating a variable that will be available throughout the entire file, meaning in this job and the next job. But if I create a variable at the job level, it gets created inside each job. Since I have one job here, I'll create it right here. I write env, and this will be job custom variable var. Let's just make it shorter and set its value to 1 as well. For example, this job custom var variable will only work in this job. If I have another job at this level, then this variable won't be available for that job. Let's just make job custom variable var essentially shorter and set its value to 1 as well. For example, this job custom var variable will basically only work in this specific job if I have another job at this particular level. Then this variable won't be available for that specific job. Specifically, it is important to note that this variable is unique to this job. And finally, the step level. In this particular step specifically, I want to introduce a new variable, which I will initialize right here at this point. Therefore, I'm going to proceed to write the letter N and then type tab custom var, just like this. And I'll set its value to 1 as well. But let's write before the one probably that this is a workflow, so it's clear in the logs. Here we have job 1 and here we have step 1. Great. So we've initialized 3 variables with different visibility levels. This variable I won't be able to use in another step. And this variable I won't be able to use in another job. But this variable I can use everywhere in this file. The second point, we can change the values of the variables. So I can change the values of these 2 variables right here in this step. In this specific example, I will carefully take this particular variable and proceed to modify its current value accordingly. I will explicitly document and note that this was initially referred to as workflow 1. However, we have now decided to change it to step 1, for instance, or alternatively, step 2. This change is significant in the context of our workflow process. So this will be the value of this variable. And next, the output. You can output in 2 ways. Here they are. We already have a demonstration. These are different variables, but the principle is absolutely the same. We can use it here as well. Let's figure out this variable. The first one. So we're using echo. We output in a simple way like this. This method, when we add the $sign, is generated by the runner, meaning it's created by the runner on the virtual machine. But we can also pass this variable through an expression and output the same variable using the context expression. So we write n, then a dot, and after the dot, we add our variable. In this case, the variable will be generated on GitHub side and sent to the virtual machine as a ready-made variable. Now I'll explain this in a bit more detail using an example, so you won't get confused about the difference between these types of variables. In the following step, we will proceed to output not only this particular one, but also the previous one that we discussed earlier. This ensures that both outputs are generated and reviewed for completeness. Alright, great. Right now, we have a number of variables. The first 2 variables that were present in GitHub Actions before us, and after them, there are 3 of our own variables that we created ourselves. Let's commit and push the changes. And let's carefully and attentively navigate to GitHub. Proceed carefully to the Actions tab. Since we did not turn it off from the previous lesson, let us now proceed to turn it off. We had the 10th workflow, and now let us carefully return to 11. There it is. It has finished, successfully completed. And let's check the logs and figure out the variables that we're getting. So, the first thing we get, guys, we're getting the GitHub branch, it seems. The same value, but these are completely different variables. So, we'll make sure of that right here. Look, our first command calls the variable and gets its value, while the second command, when we use the context, doesn't use the context here. Instead, GitHub passes the value to it. The same goes for our next variables. Notice this is a variable. At the workflow level, we replace the value, obtaining it in 2 ways. First, a command with the variable lets the runner fetch it. Second, using context, the runner outputs it directly. The next, write a command with the variable and the runner fetches the value. Using context, the runner outputs it as a value because GitHub action returns it through context. 2 variables are passed simply and the runner retrieves them. We request get us these variables and it fetches them. With context, GitHub action sends a ready-made value while this method creates it at the request stage. The next 2 variables we just pass in this simple way, trying to fetch them, and the runner retrieves them for us. So we write a request saying, hey, get us these variables, and it fetches them for us at the job and step levels. This point is pretty clear, right? When passing through an expression with context, GitHub Actions sends a ready-made value, while with this kind of passing, it will only create it at the request stage. How can this information help us? In this scope at the step level, we see both variables, but in one of the previous lessons, we used the if construct and noticed that there we used context, got some value, and compared it. How can this information help us? In this scope, we see both variables. Previously, we used the if construct, used context, got a value, and compared it. At this job level, the variable doesn't have a value yet. So at this level, which is one level above the step, at the job level, the variable of this kind simply doesn't have a value yet. It doesn't exist, we can't access it or compare it. We can only compare using context. So, if you find yourself needing to use IF in practice, keep in mind that here we use contexts. And finally, I'll show you another way we can set values for variables. We can write it into a special unique file. GitHub Action creates unique files where it stores variable values, meaning it keeps all the variables. And I can even set variables in one step and use them in another step. As you remember, the variable I set here at the step level is only available at that step level. But by using the new method, you can also use it in another step. Let's try this out in practice. I'll add a new step. The way to write a new variable with a value into a file is very simple. We're using run as part of our process. We're using the echo command. And first we give it a name, so new custom work, 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 new. New custom val equals, we set its value. New value, like this. Next, we use this symbol and refer to the default variable github.anv. Let's take a look at the documentation. Here it is, our variable. It contains the path to the unique little file as its value, and in this file, the variables are stored. Currently, at this moment, with this separate step, we've created the variable new custom var, and now, in the next step, let's output this variable. Now let's push the changes and check the values. Let's go into the workflow and wait for it to finish. Let's go in and open the logs. So let's take a look. First, we run a command that creates, or rather writes, a file with a new variable and a new value. And then, in the last line, you see, we get this new value. And as you can see, we have two different steps here. Here's another method that will be useful for you in practice. That's it for this lesson. See you in the next session.